Welcome to the 12th meeting of the Committee of Justice. The meeting is now open to the public. Just to keep you appraised, effective from the 28th of May 2024, Sinead Ennis resigned as Deputy Chairperson of the Committee and Deirdre Harkey was reappointed as Deputy Chairperson. The committee meeting is going to be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online as usual. And obviously, whilst everybody's taking their seats in the public gallery, you're all very welcome. And just a reminder that you can use your mobile devices as long as they're in airplane mode and all muted. Obviously, you can connect to the Assembly Wi-Fi and password details are in the gallery. It's not permitted to take photographs or record any of the meeting. I'm sure got it. So we have online Alex Easton and Justin McNulty. It's proposed that the oral evidence session with officials from the Government Actuaries Department on the SL1 The Damages process for setting rate of return regulations Northern Ireland 2024 and the oral evidence session with officials on the stopping domestic and sexual violence and abuse strategy will be recorded by Hansard. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Members were obliged to declare financial or other relevant interests which might reasonably be thought by others to influence our approach to matters under consideration. Anybody who has an interest to declare should do so now or at the relevant point in the course of the agenda. Does anybody have anything they wish to declare at this stage? Could I declare that I have an immediate family member who works in the legal profession? Apologies have been received from Maurice Bradley and Doug Beattie. I'm not aware of any others. No. Thank you. Agenda item 2 is draft minutes of the meeting held on the 23rd of May. The draft minutes are at pages 5 to 15 of the pack. Are members content that these are a true and accurate reflection of the proceedings of that meeting?
Agreed.
Lovely, thank you. In that case, I will sign those. Agenda item 3 is matters arising. I don't have any. I don't imagine anybody else does. No? Lovely, thank you. Agenda item 4 is the SL1, the dreaded SL1 Damages process for setting rate of return regulations Northern Ireland 2024, and I would refer members to pages 16 to 151 of the meeting pack for the relevant papers. So just to recap a bit, the committee considered a proposal for the statutory rule. I'm not going to read out the title again, at its meeting on the 25th of April 2024 and agreed to request an oral briefing from departmental officials to seek further information on a number of issues, including the potential implication of the proposed rule, how the proposed rule could impact the cost of insurance premiums, why the discount rate is different in Northern Ireland compared with England, Scotland and Wales, and how often the rate is reviewed. That oral briefing took place at the committee meeting of the 16th of May, and the committee then agreed to write to the department to emphasise that it supports the principle of 100% compensation, to ask for further clarification on the modification of the standard adjustment from 0.75% to 1.25%, and to ask for more information on the impact assessments as recommended by the predecessor Committee for Justice. At last week's meeting, the committee considered the department's response and agreed to schedule an oral evidence session with officials from the Government Actuaries Department. So members from the Government Actuaries Department are going to attend the meeting virtually to provide further information on the proposed statutory rule. So just to kind of recap where we are on this, the proposal was to move to average weekly earnings instead of the RPI. Sorry, just let me grab my glasses. That the Government Actuaries Department was content with the portfolio. It was also content with the 43-year period, which is the average life expectancy of a claimant. The proposal is to modify the standard adjustment for the impact of taxation on the cost of investment advice and management from 0.75 to 1.25%, and within that then the GAD will choose. This would bring us into alignment in terms of reviews with Scotland, and the likelihood is that it would bring us closer to the position of England and Wales whenever they strike their rate. The department had indicated that it was not for them to outline the implications for other departments, nor is it to be part of the decision that we make. So it's a difficult issue, it's a complex issue. Whether we can bear it in mind, whether they clearly can't bear it in mind in the course of their decision, nor can the actuary, but whether we can or not is another issue, and I'm not sure about that. But it'll be helpful, I think, today to hear from the Government Actuaries Department. I think that's a fair summary of where we are, isn't it?
Sorry.
Okay. So we'll move to welcome Paul Butcher, who's an actuary, and Stephen Humphrey, who is the Actuarial Director. Gentlemen, you're very welcome to the Committee for Justice. Thank you for joining us to help us work our way and navigate our way through this issue. I'll invite you to give your presentation, and then it is extremely likely that we will have questions at the end. So thank you very much indeed. I'll hand over to you.
You're on mute.
You're on mute, I think.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your invite. Can I check you can hear and see us correctly?
Yes.
Thank you.
We'll just give a few introductions first, and Paul will give most of the do most of the talking today. So I'm Stephen Humphrey. I'm an actuary at the Government Actuaries Department. I've been involved in providing advice to the department on PIDR issues for about 7 or 8 years. So I've been involved in the previous reviews and in the background of this review. Paul?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Paul Butcher, and actually from the Government Actuaries Department, lead author of the advice to the Department of Justice on the PIDR regulations features, which has been discussed today. I was planning on giving a quick introduction, if that's okay. So as an intro, I thought it would be useful to give a summary of GAD's role, the PIDR rates, and the sort of key elements of our advice. There are two main stages of our involvement. Firstly, GAD's role was to assess the evidence available to determine whether the parameters in the legislation remain appropriate, and if not, provide analysis for the department on what an evidence-based alternative would be. In due course, once review is started, the Government Actuary will be asked to determine the expected investment return on the assets, and a revised rate will be calculated. We are here today to cover that first role, which involved the advice to the department and was formalised in our report dated March 2024. It's also worth noting that the rate is a single rate, which is designed to reflect the investment returns the claimant could expect on their lump sums, netting off the inflation on their damages, tax and expenses, all with a target of claimants receiving 100% compensation. Our advice broadly had 5 conclusions. The first was that the current notional portfolio and period of investment of 43 years, which will inform the investment returns, remains appropriate. Secondly, that RPI is no longer suitable as an appropriate index for damage inflation, as this is due to be reformed in 2030. There is limited evidence on what damage inflation should be, but it's broadly agreed that it's likely to be between prices and earnings inflation. As a single index is required by legislation, judgment is therefore needed on what index is most suitable. The department's view was that earnings inflation was more prevalent than prices, and we consider that be reasonable, as assuming price inflation would mean that there's an expectation that actually a majority of claimants would not be 100% compensated. Thirdly, the standard adjustment of 0.75% for tax and investment cost is no longer appropriate. Whilst there is some evidence of higher investment costs, the main justification for changing the current adjustment is the higher expected tax costs. This is because the change in the economic climate through higher interest rates means that higher investment returns are expected, and therefore higher tax is applied to those investment returns. We suggested a range of 1 to 1.75% would be reasonable, The department's view was that 1.25 was the most appropriate adjustment, and we consider that view reasonable. Fourthly, the standard adjustment of 0.5% for the further margins remains appropriate. And finally, that a single rate mechanism remains appropriate rather than one which varies by term or another factor. So that provides a very brief overview of our role and key areas. But yeah, I felt this would be a good point to pause to ask if you had any questions. But we do recognise this is a complex area, so we suggest dealing with one point in turn. For example, talk about our role, the 100% compensation, or any of the 5 conclusions reached. Yeah, I'll pause there for any questions.
Well, can I just ask you if you would just confirm the 4th and 5th points again, please? I missed those.
Yeah, so the 4th point was around the standard adjustment of 0.5% for the further margin, and our view was that did remain appropriate at 0.5%. And the final question around to remain on a single rate or look to a rate that varies by term or by heads of loss or an alternative measure. And yeah, our view was that a single discount rate remained appropriate.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? If you're not sure, please ask, because we're better to, look, I think if we're gonna, Justin has questions, good, because this is not the time for pride. This is the time to let's get down to make sure we fully understand the decision that's in front of us. Justin? Go ahead, Justin. Justin, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry, Chair. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Stephen. The aim of the relevant legislation is to ensure 100% compensation, no more, no less, and that principle I fully support and endorse. How, therefore, is the 0.5% further margin consistent with the aim of 100% compensation?
Paul, you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah. Hope you can hear us now. Yes, so I'll start and Steve can add in additional thoughts. So yes, the broad principle in terms of how the assumptions were set is trying to be sort of best estimates. So that's a 50% likelihood of over or under compensation. The best estimate, there's always a range of possible outcomes, and best estimate is on that level. Understand when the legislation was being established first time, a further margin was deemed appropriate, and that was to reflect that you want to reduce the possible range of undercompensation, and our advice around time was that moving the margin by 0.5% would broadly expect to reduce the probability of undercompensation from 50% to around 30 to 35%. So effectively, it's to expect that 65 to 70% or more people are fully compensated, but recognise that is a balanced judgment. Steve, is there anything else to add to that?
Only that this adjustment is a common feature in setting PIDR rates, it's the only area where the assumption setting doesn't follow a best estimate basis. So the idea is that you set an overall rate best estimate, and then this 0.5% adjustment provides claimants or plaintiffs with more money so that they have a better than 50-50 chance of reproducing their damages. The 0.5 it was also common in other jurisdictions of the UK that develop legislation. So it's a common feature.
Thank you.
The 0.5 on top of the 0.75, bring it to 1.25. That's standard.
Yeah.
The
I'll pass back to Paul in a second, but I think it's useful to break down the further adjustments into the two components. There is one that was 0.75 and has been increased to 1.25, which relates to tax and expenses. There is a further adjustment of 0.5%, and it's that 0.5% which we were describing just now. And it's that, so the 0.5 is to allow for, to improve the potential for reaching the 100%. The other element is for tax and expenses of investment, and Paul will give a few comments about that.
Yeah, that's right. So as I said earlier, so our advice was the 0.75 adjustments for tax and expenses would be too low, and whilst we've seen through the evidence gathered that there's some suggestion of higher investment costs, it's largely being driven by higher tax costs. It's worth noting that in the previous advice that the Government Department gave across all sort of UK jurisdictions was that the current rate would not be appropriate for tax in a higher interest rate environment, and that is the environment we now find ourselves in compared to pre-2022. So yeah, essentially the expectation behind the modelling is that higher interest rate environment leads to higher investment returns. Those higher investment returns lead to individuals needing to pay more tax through our income tax or capital gains tax on those investments, and therefore the tax adjustment needs to increase accordingly.
Okay, thank you. In terms of this report, the Government Actuaries Department revised the average weekly earnings is likely to range between CPI plus 1.5% to CPI plus 1.8%. However, expert advice from the Oxford Economics, commissioned by the ABI, concluded that if 50% of losses are price related and 50% wage related, as was assumed by GAD in the 2019 report to the Lord Chancellor in England and Wales, a plaintiff's losses can only be expected to increase over time at around CPI plus 0.6%. Further, the GAD report accepts that an earnings-based index would potentially overestimate the inflation experience in practice. Isn't the proposal to adopt average weekly earnings, which overstates inflation, will lead to overcompensation, therefore a reason not to adopt the 0.5% further margin on top of the standard adjustment? And where I'm coming from here, folks, is essentially our insurance premiums here are the highest in the north than they are on these islands. The compensation rates by trust per year, average over the last 5 years, are 33.2 million. So there are major ramifications of this decision and this rate. Why are our premiums higher here than they are, and what's the burden on public bodies as a consequence of this rate being decided at this level?
So there's a few points in there. I'll pick up on the inflation point first. So the current regulation refers to RPI, and that was deemed a suitable measure previously because RPI at that point was between CPI and earnings. The 50-50 was very much a judgment at the time that there's not been particularly strong evidence on where damage inflation sets. So it deemed at the time that RPI was the most suitable index for damage inflation, rather than explicitly saying damage inflation is definitively 50-50 between prices and earnings. Also, the feature of our advice very much within the legislative constraints. So the constraints around the legislation was that a single index needs to be selected, and we agreed with the department's view that earnings or AWE is the most appropriate single index available to represent damage inflation, but also that the part of our discussion with the department that there is that there is not this ability to cross-subsidise across different features. Each feature needs to be set with its own appropriate measure. So the
Oh no,
Lost your sound.
I've lost you, Paul.
aspect.
Paul, I think they lost audio about 5 seconds ago.
Okay. So yeah, the last thing I was saying was around because we need to work within the legislative framework. So we did discuss with the department a range of options, and one feature that was told to us was that you cannot cross-subsidise across assumptions. So each assumption is set with its own sort of best estimate, most appropriate range, and therefore the further margin was not designed to look at different levels of damage inflation, and therefore they were separate, which is why we don't assume any possible cross subsidies across features of the discount rate.
If I could sort of pick up some of the more general points, there has always been a challenge in obtaining information on the types of damage inflation that plaintiffs and claimants are subject to. As well as the information that the ABI are able to collate, there is also information that's provided from the claimant groups, and that they provide quite a lot of support that large elements of damage inflation are wage related. So care costs and the like are likely to be sort of wage driven. So the evidence spreads across these items, and we certainly would feel very uncomfortable with a claim damage inflation of prices only. We would feel that given the mix of damages that individuals be subject to, that there ought to be a large wage component. In terms of the impact on insurance premiums, yes, it is true that this is a contributory factor. We don't have modelling of the precise impact, so I can't tell you what a move of 1 or 2% in the PIDR does to insurance premiums, but it's certainly true that it is a key factor, and that is recognised in the importance in setting the discount rate and providing advice. Is there anything else we should pick up in that, Paul?
I think so, yeah, unless there's any follow-up on that.
Okay, Justin, are you finished? Gents, can I just clarify a couple of things? It had been mooted amongst members last week, or some members last week, about the impact if the rate just stayed the same. So I suppose there's a couple of things that we're trying to get our heads around. Some people had suggested they felt that it would be, we were more likely to stay as close as possible to the 100% mark if the rate did not change. Others have suggested that to move from 0.75 to 1.25 would mean a potential overcompensation for claimants. Could you give us your answers to those, please, so that we just have a greater degree of understanding around those particular areas?
I think I'll give a few comments and then pass to Paul. So one general comment to make is that future investment returns aren't known. They will vary, and they can only be assessed as an estimate. The returns that individuals actually achieve is going to provide quite a range, and the variation in that is quite a large variation, which in practice will depend on the types of damage that the individual is trying to reproduce, how successful they are with their investment returns. So I sort of turn the question around a little bit, that you can never be sure that you're providing 100% compensation. There will always be the risk of undercompensation, and there will always be the risk of overcompensation. In setting the parameters, you are looking to balance those two risks. If there were a lower allowance for tax and expenses, then that would risk that you undercompensate individuals, that you don't give them enough money, and they suffer higher rates of taxation and are unable to reproduce their amounts. Paul, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I guess just to reiterate the point in our advice that the current, so talking about that particular adjustment for tax and expenses of 0.75 is below the range that we consider appropriate within GAT. So our view is that the current is not in line with the principle, and does therefore have increased risk on a compensation. But also, our view is that the department's move to 1.25 is reasonable, and is much more comfortably within the range where we consider that is an appropriate adjustment. And as I said, that is largely driven by the expectation of the higher interest rates leading to higher tax returns, to higher investment returns, which is then just netted off by tax. So overall, the investment returns should be higher. You've just got a large proportion of tax, whereas when you're in a very low interest rate environment, because they're very small investment returns, it's much more reasonable to expect that most of those investment returns could be covered by tax-free allowances and other sort of tax management systems. But in a higher interest rate environment, it's reasonable to expect that people will pay more income and capital gains tax, and that's sort of the key driver in our mind for the need to increase from 0.75 to 1.25.
And finally, could I just clarify that? Is it you can't take into account the implications for insurance, or is it the Department of Justice, or is it both?
So I think in my view, we are answering the questions that the department provide to us, but we will be conscious of the environment in which these rates are being set, and we clearly understand our role as helping the department to set the parameters as best estimates, and then the 0.5 further adjustment. I think if there were a desire to change the balance of under and over compensation, that would be something for the legislators, not for GAD to do. Paul?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
All right, thanks very much. And I obviously missed the last briefing session on this, so apologies if there's I know it talks about in terms of an impending review and just obviously the regulatory framework that as a result of the forthcoming review, it said that it may affect the insurance policies. So I'm just wondering, the forthcoming review, is it going to be also reviewing the two areas that we're considering as part of this paper today? Is that going to be part of the review?
The moving from AWE to
Yeah.
yes,
And the one.
so it's essentially two. Well, as I understand, it's two questions. One is the moving from
The average weekly.
to AWE instead of RPI, and then the proposal is that the standard adjustment for the impact of taxation would be 0.75 to 1.25 on every other area. My understanding is people were agreed. Part of the consultation, and it's important to suppose that the committee notes this, part of the consultation, nearly all the responses came back to say everybody would prefer to move to CPI plus.
Yeah.
But at this point, that's not in the legislative parameters. So the department has indicated that it is potentially going to look at that for the next review in 5 years. But this review is due to kick off in July. So the committee's job is to make a recommendation to the House one way or another. But it's two very specific questions. The predecessor committee had asked for the department to take into account implications, but the department has said it can't nor should it speak on behalf of other departments. So that's why we're a bit stuck, because because we're maybe trying to take into account things that we shouldn't, and I'm not clear whether we are allowed to be mindful of those issues, but somebody has to be mindful of the issues. Nevertheless, our job here and everybody's job here is to plump for the option the main that gets us as close to 100% compensation as possible, no more, no less, and that's the key issue.
Because the bit I was going to ask again on the the letter, from the department in our pack, again, when you look at the regulatory framework, it talks about that there was an assessment carried out in terms of the current methodology for setting the discount rate, and concluded it wasn't possible to quantify the impact on businesses. It also said, obviously, that the forthcoming review may impact on the cost of policies for businesses, charities, social economy and enterprises. So are they saying they can't quantify it just on the business element or across all of those different sectors that were named in the sentence above? Does that include they can't quantify for charities, social economy and social enterprises and voluntary bodies? Because I think we do need to maybe seek legal advice in terms of those broader implications and around what we can consider and what we can't.
Well, I suppose before we take a decision on any of this, does anybody have any further questions for the actuaries? Kieran, do you
Just one question, and Andrea's did as well, because obviously throughout the report there was always, it's the claimants versus dependents, and there was disagreement. So that's why obviously you have the grey area, and obviously based on the government actuary and what you have said. Just on relation to the life expectancy, obviously there was kind of claimants pushing for a 30-year, and then the 45, and you went with and that's the 43. Can you just, in layman terms, kind of explain, could I just give an example? If I was an 82-year-old and I had a serious accident and I was seeking compensation, and would that mean, obviously the decisions that are made can't be based on an individual, it's a collective, but based on the life expectancy and etc. Just if you could just explain in layman terms how it works, and if I was to secure personal injury investment, how that is looked at, and to ensure that I get 100% and no less, just in layman terms.
Hi, if I could sort of have a first go at that, and then Paul will add some comments. So I'll talk through a little bit how claims work, but in terms of the duration point, I think it's important to note that the 43 years is an average across all areas, and if you move that a little bit, it wouldn't really change the answer. It's not it's not a parameter that, let's say you moved it up for 5 years either way, you'd really get very much different of an answer. It's not that sensitive to the outcome. In terms of your example, an old individual suffering damage, any compensation that's provided would be assessed on the life expectancy relating to that individual. So they're not expected to live 43 years. They might be expected to live 10 years or whatever is appropriate. The discount rate that is applied for those 10 years is the same discount rate that applies for a 20-year-old who's suffered an injury. And so the eventual rate is applied across all cases, regardless of their age. And in looking at this, we have done some work on how investment returns might vary by term, and further underlying work. If you were to try to create complicated arrangements where discount rates changed for the short, the long term, or the medium, or some other model, the expectation is that you'll be building up something that is very complicated and may not actually help the legal processes. So when jurisdictions have asked, would it be better to have more complicated rates, practitioners in the industry have not been keen on developing that complexity. Paul?
Yeah, I wonder if it's worth just adding a clarification around, so what the discount rate ultimately is determining a sort of a net interest rate, so a net return rate that you expect, and that's an annual rate. So when you are looking at your older claiming that their life expectancy might only be 10 years, then that rate is converted into a multiplier, and there's some tables called the Ogden tables that are produced to help the defence do that. So therefore, if someone's expected to live 10 years, then they will have a shorter reduction in their lump sum for that period of 10 years investment compared to a much longer term claim. So that life expectancy is allowed for in the way the discount rate is used, rather than being affected by the discount rate, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Here,
Yeah.
thank you. Is everybody fine then with what we've heard from the actuaries? Nobody has any further questions? Deirdre, could I ask if you would, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time. We really appreciate that. It's been helpful for us. I think on the basis that we probably don't need anything more, I'd like to thank you both for taking the time to try to explain to us. It's at moments like these where I'm glad I did linguistics and not mathematics. But it's horses for courses, and thank you very much for your help and assistance as we seek to work our way around this issue. So thank you very much indeed for taking the time to attend the committee.
Thank you. I hope we've been helpful. There is always the offer there of further assistance should the committee need it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen. Yeah. Could I ask if you would tell us where you are in the papers about the issue that you raised, just so that we can all get there?
Oh, sorry, yes. It's in the letter that came from David Graham.
Which is that?
It is on page, 20 in the pack. So it's under the heading Regulatory Impact.
Okay, yeah.
So it says that also, obviously, that it can't be taken into account.
In this
I know it mentions businesses in terms of, in the forthcoming review, insurance policies purchased by businesses, but it says charities, social economy may be impacted, but then when you go further down, when they've done a piece of work, it only mentions businesses. But I don't know if they're covering all of those, like social economy and enterprises, in the same assessment, that they can't quantify the impact. Or indeed the legal, should we even be considering it?
Okay, so I'm just kind of checking the procedures around this. Did you initially mention legal advice on this issue? The turnaround for legal advice is 10 working days. This review is due to kick off in July. Obviously, we're 2 of those weeks we're out on visits, so there won't be a formal meeting.
Yeah.
I suppose, right.
Surely, I mean, we can't read into what we can't read into the mind of the author of the letter, but I think it's just a shorthand for saying businesses. I mean, a social enterprise is going to have the same insurance policy because they have employees, they have premises. It's the same policy. It's just a range of people that are likely to be insured. But I think, Chair, the issue, the thing that struck me from listening to the people from London there, the actuaries, was that they're certainly not going to say the effect, that they're not going to say that they're not going to take responsibility for the effect or effect on insurance policies. What they're saying is that is up to the legislature. We presumably could, the department could lay the SI, and we could presumably lay an alternative, say we decided 1% rather than 1.25, but we would be doing that at our risk and against what in truth is the most competent advice available to the United Kingdom government on this matter. I think we would do it at our peril.
I must say, in that respect, I concur. I suppose there are a few things to bear in mind in this. It is ultimately the department's decision. The committee's role in this is to recommend or otherwise. Ultimately, this falls to the department. So it seems to me that there are probably 3 options. One is to recommend. The other is, to recommend affirmation. The other one is to not recommend affirmation. The third option may be if members feel that they cannot make a recommendation either way to the House, then I think that there are a number of things that we probably should record in terms of a report to the House, because ultimately the House is going to have to make a decision. The department will lay this and the House will have to make a decision. So, as I see it, the situation is as follows. Everybody wanted CPI plus, but it can't be done, and the department has undertaken that it will look to move to CPI at the next option and legislate for that accordingly. So that's one issue. We can note the move to average weekly earnings instead of RPI. We can note the modification of the standard adjustment for the impact of taxation and cost of investment advice and management from 0.75 to 1.25. We can note that GAD considers that appropriate, that GAD is content with the portfolio of the 43 years, that the department and GAD are not able to take into account anything beyond the 100% compensation issue. We can note that GAD still said the 0.5% margin was appropriate. We can note that the increase is because tax paid has increased, and we could note the concerns expressed around insurance premiums and the impacts on policyholders and defendants. And then at that point, if we publish everything we've got, then the House can make its own decision. But it depends whether or not members feel they're in a position to make a recommendation to the House or otherwise. So I'm seeking your views on that.
I think, Chair, I could go along with those caveats that you've put in place by way of a report if it included a recommendation from us to accept in the circumstances that this is to be reviewed. I'm not being cynical, but truth to tell, we've struggled with this and we've got the very best advice. The 80 odd other experts in the House are just going to make a dog's dinner of this. And I think that's probably not the best direction to put it into. If we can't make a decision, then I really despair that the House could make a decision on this.
I think that's a fair enough point. What I didn't want was
Sorry.
Look, the issue for me was the committee has sought evidence from everybody on every side and heard from, whether it was written or oral, heard from every side of this argument to the point actually where we maybe had too much and confused ourselves. Yeah. As we sought to try and fully understand the implications of the decision and what it meant. But I'm trying to navigate a way through it with that people are comfortable with where we're going. Deirdre, you wanted to come in?
No, just to concur with, I suppose, the caveat you laid out in the approach that Stuart's proposed, we would be happy with that.
Yeah, because what I'm not clear about is whether or not we can take into account the implications. The department may not be able to.
I don't think we can.
The GAD can't, but I'm not clear whether we can, and we've got it. The primary issue here is 100% compensation.
No, absolutely, it has to be.
And I'm not sure advice gets better than the Government Actuaries Department, to be honest. So, where are we saying that this committee is content to recommend affirmation?
With the concerns outlined.
Noting.
Yes.
Noting the concerns
Yes.
outlined.
Yeah.
Yes.
They do broke down there, John.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Chair, is the committee agreed to publish do they wish to publish the documentation and something that you've outlined in this letter that will go to the department?
Is the committee content to publish the documentation? Justin, I'll come to you in just 2 seconds. Is the committee content to publish the documentation that we've received so that anybody who wishes to delve into it further and see the evidence that we
Absolutely.
received
It has to be
and the
open.
extent to which we
Yes.
sought to
Yes.
get everybody's content?
And this letter that we will send on setting out the committee's concerns.
And that the letter will go to the department and that would be published, setting out the committee's concerns around some of the issues.
Yeah.
Content?
Yeah.
Justin, can I bring you in, please?
Thank you.
Justin?
Thank you, Chair. I just think we need to highlight the reality that we are concerned. We fully support and endorse the principle of 100% compensation, absolutely, but we have to express a view on the implication of this for public bodies and an implication of this for insurance premium payers and why we have the highest insurance costs on these islands. We can't just wave that through when that remains the reality.
No, Justin, that was my point. So that's why I said, look, we note all of the things that GAD has said, we note the parameters, we note the limitations on the department, we note all these things, and we also note the concerns expressed around insurance in terms of premiums and claimants and defendants. We note all of that, and we're mindful of it, and the evidence would demonstrate that. So, and that, all of this would be included in the documentation. And I think I think that's the nub of our issue, that we are mindful of the implications of the decision on insurance. So, otherwise, I think if it weren't for that, I suspect we'd agree. It's the insurance issue that's the sticking point for us. So, to my mind, this was a way to get through this. So that would all be noted and expressed. Are you content?
Content.
Yeah? Thank you. Right. Thank you very much, members. That's helpful. All right. Do I need to put a question formally or?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So, are members content then that we affirm the recommendation to approve, but stipulate the points of note as outlined, including our concerns around the implications for insurance?
Yes.
Could I ask everybody in favour to raise your hand? Justin, Sinead, could you indicate? There's, yeah.
Justin's his hand raised at the maybe his vote.
Justin, can I just check that your raised hand is your vote and not a query?
Correct.
You're agreed, are you?
Agreed.
Thank you. Sinead?
Chair, yeah, Chair, I'm agreed as well.
Thank you very much. So, it was unanimous. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next item, which is agenda item 5, Stopping Domestic and Sexual Violence and Abuse Strategy, which is at pages 152 to 298 of the meeting pack for the relevant papers. Departmental officials are in attendance to provide a briefing on the new 7-year Stopping Domestic and Sexual Violence and Abuse Strategy, and I would welcome to the meeting Julie Wilson. Julie, you're welcome back, who is the Deputy Director in the Victim Support Division, Emma Crozier, who's the Head of the Violence Against the Person branch, and Leonie Gilmore, who is Deputy Principal in the Violence Against the Person branch. Ladies, thank you very much. Apologies that we had to put you through all of that. That was quite torturous, but we got there in the end, and thank you for your patience and forbearance. I'm going to invite you to give your presentation. I'm sure there'll be some questions for you at the end, but for now the meeting is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. So thank you for this opportunity to brief you on work to develop a new 7-year domestic and sexual abuse strategy. It's intended to build on the previous strategy, which originally ran from 2016 to 2023. And then in the absence of ministers, the final Year 7 action plan was extended by way of an addendum. That strategy delivered a number of important developments, including the launch of the Domestic Violence and Abuse Disclosure Scheme, or DVADS, the introduction of a new domestic abuse offence that covers not just physical violence but also coercive control, the launch and rollout of Operation Encompass to ensure that children who have experienced domestic abuse in their homes are supported within the school environment, the provision of new advocacy support services to those experiencing abuse, and the establishment of domestic homicide reviews to learn lessons so that we can enhance protections and hopefully prevent future deaths. However, despite this progress, domestic abuse alone still accounts for almost a fifth of all police recorded crime. And so I want to acknowledge up front that there's still a lot more that we need to do collectively to tackle domestic and sexual abuse. And this new draft strategy is intended to help us to do that. So whilst any strategy needs to be clear about the vision that it's setting, it also needs to be more than mere words. So this is intended to set the direction for the delivery of achievable, measurable and meaningful improvements. And running through each section of the strategy is therefore an integrated performance framework that sets out the outcomes that we're seeking to deliver, indicators of what success looks like, and what we're going to measure to see if we're achieving what we're setting out to achieve. Alongside the draft strategy, we've also developed an initial 3-year action plan. This is a change in approach since our last strategy, which was delivered through a series of annual action plans. But since delivery of many of the planned actions are going to span several years, we believe a multi-year action plan is the best approach. In terms of scope, the strategy is jointly led by the Department of Justice and the Department of Health, with input from other departments, notably Education, Communities and the Executive Office. And I want to touch for a moment on particularly on the interdependencies with the Executive Office's strategy on ending violence against women and girls and on the alignment between the two strategies. We believe it's right that there are two separate strategies. They are distinct and they're seeking to address different issues. On the one hand, you have domestic and sexual abuse, which can happen to anybody, irrespective of their age, their race, their gender identity or sexual orientation, their ethnicity or their background. And we need to respond to the breadth and the diversity of need there. On the other hand, you have a strategy which is looking at gender-specific violence against women and girls, but not just limited to that domestic and sexual offences. So there are two strategies, but we can't ignore the interdependencies. We know that women and girls are disproportionately affected by domestic and sexual abuse. So anything that we do to tackle it under our strategy is also going to deliver outcomes against that end in violence against women and girls strategy. So they are ultimately complementary and mutually reinforcing strategies. And we're going to continue to work collaboratively with the Executive Office to ensure that there's alignment and a joined up response. I've said that anyone can be a victim of domestic and sexual abuse, and individuals can present with a number of different characteristics. Through the strategy, we want to progress work that's going to help us to understand intersectional needs better, and we also want to carry out work that's going to help us to understand how best to respond to intergenerational abuse. In terms of the structure, the strategy has 5 pillars: partnership, prevention, children and young people, support and provision, and justice. And I'd probably add that partnership pillar is really more than a pillar. It's I'm going to mix metaphors, but it's a thread that runs through the entire strategy. We can't do this alone. Domestic and sexual abuse affects the whole of society, so it needs a cross-sectoral whole society response. The strategy cuts across the work of multiple departments and operational agencies, but I also want to acknowledge the role of voluntary and community sector partners in delivering services, sharing knowledge and expertise, and communicating the voices and views of those with lived experience. The second pillar is prevention, and our focus here is on making sure that people are informed and aware of different types of abuse, challenging attitudes and behaviours, and building capacity and capability to identify and respond to abuse earlier. The third pillar focuses on children and young people. We know that their experiences of domestic and sexual abuse can result in lifelong trauma, so we want to make sure that they feel confident to report abuse, that they can access services and support to help them recover. Early intervention is going to be key, including understanding about forming healthy relationships. Fourth pillar is about ensuring access to tailored support and provision. And finally, the fifth pillar is about ensuring that our justice responses are effective. And this includes work to improve confidence in reporting abuse and reducing barriers to participating in the justice system. Very briefly, I'd like to touch on how we've developed the strategy and informed it. We launched a joint call for views with the Executive Office in January 2022. The responses from that then identified issues and key themes that informed the development of the initial draft strategy, which we then launched for public consultation in February 23. We also held a number of public engagement events online and then also met bilaterally with individual stakeholders to discuss specific points. And throughout that process, we've worked really closely with TEO to identify areas of shared interest and to keep that alignment. The engagement process confirmed broad support for the overall vision and outcomes, but it did raise important issues that we've sought to address in the revised strategy, including greater clarity around governance and performance metrics to enable us to assess the strategy's impact and that it's doing what we want it to do, and also the inclusion of a specific pillar on children and young people. Funding was also raised, and specifically the need for the strategy to be adequately funded, and we acknowledge this, and we've acknowledged it in the draft strategy, and noted too that we'll include delivery costs in action plans where these are known. However, as you'll be aware, funding and affordability issues are likely to remain challenging, and they are likely to affect the scale and the pace of delivery. I hope that you have found this brief overview helpful, and we're happy to try to answer any questions that you might have.
Open the floor to members. Anybody have anything? Deirdre?
Thanks very much just for the update. It was just the issue I know it's raised in the paper in terms of funding for the action plan and the work going forward, and I know you touched on in terms of collaboration and alignment with the departments. So it's just to get a sense of, obviously budgets are being agreed at the moment within departments, so what work has been taking place around that. what's practical in the first kind of 2 years of the action plan in terms of what can be delivered. And is there good cross-departmental work, or are there gaps in certain areas? And, you know, could we be more effective with the budgets that we have by just designing it? And just the issue around, you touched on in terms of the call for evidence around the work of the voluntary and community sector, and I suppose just to highlight even the loss of funding to women's aid and the impact that that has, because they would have been, you know, very much involved in the other strategies that you've said. So just the impact of that going forward in terms of those organisations. And I suppose the delivery board and oversight, if you can give me a bit of an update on who's involved in that from across the departments, what that looks like. And also, are there external partners, you know, organisations such as Women's Aid or others out there that are part of the board? So just a couple, thanks.
Okay, if I go with funding first and then remind me if I miss,
no
if
worries.
I miss any. On funding, I mean, we've very, very recently had our departmental budgets confirmed. Some of the things that we would deliver through the action plan, certainly within justice, are covered by our core budget, and we've had confirmation that some of that is in place, and other departments will be in a similar position where they fund some of the measures that they have included in the strategy and action plan from their core budgets. In addition, there is a cross-departmental budget, which has been confirmed as, sorry, let me take a drink.
Oh, okay.
It's been confirmed as 1.62 million, 1.621 million. And so we've had that confirmed. As an oversight board, we haven't had an opportunity to look at the allocation of that, because it's literally just we'd invited bids from across departments for them to submit bids to the oversight board for what they would need from that. Obviously 1.62 million, it's not a huge amount. We are going to have to look at how we prioritise. That's been the position for the last few years, where the strategy delivery board has taken decisions around the allocation of that funding based on statutory and contractual commitments, based on what's the impact going to be on victims, and where can we get the biggest impact, based on alignment with strategic outcomes. And that's going to be the approach that we'll take again, and then we'll make recommendations to ministers as to the allocation of that funding. So some things covered by departmental budgets, some things covered by that 1.62 million, but it's, we anticipate that it will be oversubscribed, and we absolutely will need to prioritise. And that then comes back to my point about scale and pace of delivery will be impacted. We will look to explore other options for whether there are other pockets of funding that we can access at different times. But again, I mean, there are certainly uncertainties around future funding, and but we will seek to explore options where we can.
But your confidence, in terms of the action plan, that you could roll out as much of that, notwithstanding some of those challenges, or there are certain areas you would focus on more?
There are some, certainly from a justice perspective, there are some things within the action plan that we've included, and we've said that we would want to do this, and it will rely on additional funding being found for it. So there are some things that we're already funded for. There are some things that we don't have that funding for, and there are some things that would be subject to the board. We would anticipate, we've made a bid for part of that 1.62 million, and so but those conversations haven't yet been had about how that gets divided up. In terms of, you'd asked whether we work effectively. I think we can always work more effectively together. Certainly, as an oversight board, we have representation from each of those key departments that are kind of feeding into the strategy. Each of the departments is bidding for funding. We've worked really closely with the departments to look at how the strategy's developed, and look at how different measures that a particular department is responsible for, how they work together. to reinforce the package of measures really that the action plan and the strategy will deliver. And as part of that also then I mentioned that we've been working really closely with the Executive Office on their strategy and how that aligns as well. So I think we can always do better. There would be things, particularly with the Executive Office, where I think there's opportunities for us to work closely on. I mean, I think it's understood that there are data gaps, you know, and we need to look at how we gather data, you know, rather than us all looking at how we gather data. You know, can we do that collectively? Can we? So there are opportunities for us to work collectively on pieces of, you know, individual pieces of work to realise where the synergies are. Now you know, there will be differences. You know, the Executive Office is going to be wanting to look through the lens of women and girls, and we'll want to gather other data, you know, that's not just specifically women and girls, but there are opportunities to work more closely together. You also asked about funding for the voluntary sector, and we absolutely recognise the really important role that the voluntary sector plays. And also understand that the Department of Health has found it necessary to discontinue a range of funding for voluntary and community sector, including Women's Aid Federation. And I think there has been an assembly question that's been asked about this, and we've responded by saying that as a department we're not in a position to pick up on that. And I think again it's one of those things that, you know, we can look at as a strategic oversight board in terms of that 1.62 million, but I think we haven't had that conversation yet. We haven't looked at how that 1.62 million gets divided out, and I just know that it's going to be oversubscribed. There are other areas where, as a department, we are either grant funding or contracting services from the voluntary and community sector. So there's funding streams going in that way. And also, I understand that through the Assets Recovery Community Scheme, Women's Aid Federation for Northern Ireland has been allocated funding for very discrete project work. So one of those is around the development of a forum for people with lived experience, so that we can, you know, engage and get, you know, be informed by their experiences, and then also for training as well. So it doesn't replace the funding that they lost, but it contributes to where there are some gaps.
Thanks very much.
I'm not sure. Did I answer?
Yeah, no. Thank you.
Thanks.
It's just one area in relation to it. So over the last 7 or 8 years, obviously it's critical, and key actions have been delivered and will be ongoing, and obviously in the revision of the strategy. Regarding the collaboration, I suppose has there been any short or medium term savings that can be reinvested into those outstanding actions? And obviously I welcome your partner organisation bringing additional money to enhance the actions within the strategy, but there's outstanding actions, and obviously budgets are tight, as we know. So has there been anything over the last 7 years through that effective collaboration, cross-departmental working, and just through efficiencies, that you were able to redirect resources into additional and fulfilling additional actions? Or is that something that you'd be looking more?
I mean, certainly there has been some redirecting of resources. Sometimes it's not always been through efficiencies. It's been through not being able to spend on one thing because there's maybe been a recurring tail of funding, you know, or cost, you know. So, you know, we've been working on a year-by-year basis, and where there would be recurring costs from the introduction of something. We've not always been able to introduce it because that future funding hasn't been guaranteed. So there have been some things like the introduction of children's solas that we haven't been able to do yet because of that future funding piece. So in those cases, funding like that has been redirected, and I'm trying to think of examples of where we've been able to do something else. I don't have any examples in front of me, and I can't think of them off the top of my head, so I don't really want to ad lib in case I get it wrong.
I appreciate that, but obviously you would assume over the years, and I know 7 years is quite short in the development of a strategy, getting up and running and clear actions and trying to monitor and evaluate. I do appreciate that, but I suppose it's a point of, in doing that effective collaboration work that you are doing, you need to start to see then that the cost efficiencies that are being built in, and that's improvements, but cost efficiency, so you can redirect with the same amount of money into the additional new services that aren't being able to proceed because you have a baseline amount of funding, and you're constantly reliant then, whether it's monitoring rounds and stuff. So it'll be interesting maybe in the next 5-6 years to see where that added value and how the efficiency within the department and within all the organisations you can improve the service. But no, thank you.
Do you have anything?
No, I did actually ask the questions I was going to ask. It was really around the interdepartmental working on the budget, and that's been very helpful. Thank you.
I could. Oh, Justin, I'll take Justin, and then I'll come in. Go ahead, Justin.
Thanks, Chair. Why have reports required to be laid within 2 years of the commencement of the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act, NI 2021, sections 29 and 34, not being laid? Is work underway to deliver these, and how does this impact overall delivery of the strategy? What impact is this having on victims?
Are you referring to the reports on the operation of the Act, or on domestic abuse proceedings, or protection orders and notices?
Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act.
So I think it's the SIGINI reports.
Right.
And the report on training, and do you want to talk about
Sure, yeah. It's the reporting requirements then that we're referring to. Yeah, so there's a lot of reporting requirements set out in the 2021 Act, as you've said. One of them was for us to appoint an independent body to review how implementation of the 2021 Act has been. So we actually appointed SIGINI, who published a report last month on the operation of the Act. It was overall all positive. In respect to the Department of Justice, there was 3 recommendations for us. They really referred to ensuring that we get our statutory guidance and our e-learning. They agreed that they were positive bits of work, but really promoting them, how we could get that out there wider. So that's something we'll be taking forward. So SIGINI's just one part of that. We're also working with our statisticians across the various criminal justice organisations, and we'll be producing a report on numbers of domestic abuse offences. So that'll be from police statistics right through to prosecutions and convictions. And one other thing, we're also required on an annual basis to produce a training statement. So our last one was produced in August 23, and we'll be producing another one and publishing that on the website in August of this year. So they're mostly our requirements under the Act.
Okay, why were the reports not delivered within the time frame?
I believe
The only one we have so far to have laid is the training statement, which was laid.
they have been within the time frame. I think the one thing which hasn't under the Act that hasn't been within the time frame was a requirement to bring forward regulations for domestic abuse protection orders and notices, and we've previously provided some written briefing to the committee that there are, as we've been taking forward that piece of work, there are issues that we've identified that that really we need to look at more closely. There are certainly operational issues. There are issues with the volume of notices and that would be generated by the current draft of the legislation, and we also have concerns about not just cost but actually the added value that they would bring. Our assessment is that they would be very expensive, but they wouldn't actually enhance protections for victims of domestic abuse in a meaningful way beyond the what would already be available through other measures. So we're considering that further. The Minister's given consideration as well to how we ought to proceed, and we're looking at different options. So that's the only thing under the Act that we haven't done within the time frame, but it wasn't a reporting requirement, it was a requirement to bring to lay regulations before the Assembly.
Thank you very much.
I think I might come in on that one, Julie, because I understand that, you've identified issues, and it might be helpful to get an update on what some of those are. You've outlined some, but actually to get the detail, because the issue is that I appreciate that was came from our predecessor committee and wasn't part of, but the debate around its value and all of the rest of it was whenever it was debated in the House. The issue is that the Assembly made a decision that the department was to do this. So it's not really for the department to say, no, we're not going to do that. It's the law now. So I think probably we would like to have an update on that, because clearly the House felt it was of sufficient value and merit to take forward that piece of work. So maybe at some stage you would give us an update on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, I can touch on some of the issues now, if you like. As we've drafted the legislation, as they're currently drafted, police would be required to make a domestic abuse protection notice where there's risk of harm from domestic abuse. It has been a very complex process to try to then look at how many of those would be issued in a year, and then the associated costs from that. But there's been a lot of kind of looking at, the impact in terms of the just the volume of cases, and flowing from that, the likely costs for police would be within the first year of introduction 12 million, rising to 17 million. Some of the issues then associated with it are also around the time frame within which, if a police officer goes out, particularly in the middle of the night, to respond to a call and decides that they need to issue a protection notice, the time frame then for that to be brought to the court, for the court to consider for an application for a domestic abuse protection order, it needs to be a compressed time frame, and the operational arrangements to do that, particularly where it occurs in the middle of the night, which most of those calls would be, the operational arrangements aren't there to support it, so they would need new processes and new to be in place to support that to happen. And
they would, or the courts would?
Courts and police would both need to have new processes. However, kind of cutting through all of this, aside from the affordability issues of in terms of the sheer amount that it would cost, as they're currently drafted, the restrictions that a protection notice could place on an individual mirror what would already be available under police bail conditions. So they wouldn't actually add to or enhance the available protections in any way. We had looked at whether it was possible to include positive requirements, so a requirement to do, for example, a behavioural change programme, or a substance misuse programme, but the availability of those programmes couldn't be guaranteed at this point because they're just not in place in that volume, and the system's capacity to deliver them isn't there. So they haven't been included within the current draft regulations, and as a result, the protections that would be available under a domestic abuse protection notice or order would be the same as what is currently available under police bail. So the system would be hugely resource intensive. Our assessment is would potentially deflect police away from other policing priorities in order to support delivery of this system with that huge volume of cases, but wouldn't at this point actually be able to deliver anything additional. So we're trying to work through those issues. We're looking at things like the threshold for when a domestic abuse protection notice would be triggered. We're looking at things like that to see, well, what would that do in terms of the volume of cases? If it's currently set at risk of harm, should it be set at risk of serious harm? So those are kind of the considerations that we're trying to work through at this point in time, but we just haven't got there yet.
Yeah, I think we would all appreciate if you'd keep us updated on this. I think that there is some consternation in circumstances where the Assembly has passed law, and it's not for the first time that those who are supposed to implement it determine which aspects of it they will and which aspects of it they won't, and what should be prioritised and what shouldn't whenever the Assembly has already voted on that. And certainly that happened within human trafficking, and now we're seeing it within domestic abuse. All of those issues, I suspect, were thoroughly debated in this room and on the floor of the House. So I understand the resourcing issues at present. However, I would be concerned about the general principle that the police and the department decide we'll prioritise this and we won't prioritise that, regardless of what the House has said and how the House has voted. Okay, but that's fair enough. If you'll keep us updated now, it would be helpful. Just I have a couple of other things. Yeah, working through kind of your paper, it's useful. I've spoken to you before. The intersectionality issue, I understand the need to tailor services to people's needs, but I suppose my query around that is, how do you tailor around people's needs? But when you get into the arena of intersectionality, there is grave potential to create a hierarchy of victims. So, to my mind, anybody faced with these circumstances is having an awful time. So, is it worse for some than others? I'm not sure that it is. So, how do we balance your proposal of intersectionality versus not creating a hierarchy of victims? The next thing is around Operation Encompass. I know that you intend to roll that out. I think that Operation Encompass is a great thing. However, the PSNI had to absorb the funding for that. So if you're going to roll it out further across nursery schools and so on, to which I have no objection, is the PSNI going to receive additional funding for that? With regard to the issues around RSE, there are elements around RSE that are controversial, you'll appreciate, and it's a very difficult space for schools, parents, guardians, teachers, governors, all of those things, because we need children to have an understanding, but it needs to be at an appropriate level, and who determines what's appropriate and what are the rules for everybody within all of that. So I note that within your proposals, there's a lot of querying with teachers, whether or not they're well enough equipped and whether they have what they need and all of these things. What I'm not seeing within this is how you're going to consult with parents about whether things are working for them and whether things are as they deem it might be for their own children. There's mention in this I'm not sure, it's page 252 of ours, but I'm not sure what that is for you, about a DAS pilot. I don't know what that is. And finally, just in terms of the prioritisation, this is, I suppose, led by health and justice with, I think, education, communities and the executive office also participating. So how is work and money prioritised? Does each prioritise within their own area? Do the leads agree what the priorities will be? Does each prioritise within their own remit and their own money? Or how is this going to work in terms of prioritising the issues within this and finding the money to take it forward?
If I answer that point first, there's a little bit of both. I mean, departmental inputs have been led by departments, where there is something which is some for health to deliver or for education, and it falls entirely within the remit of those departments. They have identified what their priorities are in terms of their response to domestic and sexual abuse and how it contributes to this strategy. Some of what they've identified will be met by their departmental core budget, and that's where they're prioritising. Where we come into collectively together is around that shared budget and what gets met out of that. And as an oversight board, we have asked for bids into that from across the different departments, and as an oversight board we'll consider those bids and how they align with the strategic objectives under the strategy and the action plan, and we'll make recommendations then to ministers about how that funding should be allocated. Like I said, that it will be oversubscribed. We will take other opportunities to, if they arise, to bid for additional funding. But we're operating on the basis that we have a relatively small cross-departmental budget, and we're also prioritising things within our own core budget. So there are some of the things that we would meet from within our departmental budget, for example, would include funding for behavioural change programmes within PVNI, etc. Likewise, Department for Communities will they fund Women's Aid Refuges, and that's from their departmental budget rather than from that shared pot. So there's a little bit of both. It's each individual department prioritising within its own budget, but then also collectively agreeing how this 1.62 million can be allocated between us. In terms of the intersectionality question, I think we absolutely agree that there shouldn't be a hierarchy of victims. I think the intersectionality piece comes into its own in that the victims will present with different needs. What we have in place is an advocacy service that is intended to provide support to any victim, but to identify what their needs are and maybe refer on to other services. The approach within that advocacy service will be looking at kind of high risk, high harm, and so there does need, I think, to be a proportionate response. Every victim's needs, and I absolutely agree that any victim facing these offences is facing an appalling experience and appalling times and needs that support. The reality is that our resources are limited, and so they need to be targeted where that need is greatest. So the approach within our advocacy service or the services that we fund has been that they are services that are available to all. There may be additional needs where people are being referred into other services, and I accept that there are often waiting lists for those services because of resourcing constraints as well. So I think what we're trying to do is understand more about people's needs and how they are impacted by their experiences and who they are and what their life is like and what challenges they're facing. So understand more about that, understand where there are gaps in the system, but also ensuring that there is a service that is tailored, that is available to anyone, but that will be proportionate to the harm and the risk that they're experiencing, simply because we have to tailor and target our resources at that high harm, high risk.
Thank you.
You'd asked about RSE as well.
I'd asked about RSE, I'd asked about Encompass and the funding for police, and I'd asked what the DAS pilot was.
On RSE, again, the input to the strategy when it comes to education has come from the Department of Education and has been agreed with their minister, and I'm not sided on what they're doing to engage with parents. It's very much focused on informing and empowering and enabling both professionals but also families and carers who are working with children to be able to identify risk and respond to that risk. And I think it does form part of that wider package for children and young people. So preventing where possible, and that includes through understanding about healthy relationships. And I appreciate that some of that is contentious and there needs to be consultation with parents, but it's not just about that. It's about empowering the people who are around children and young people to be able to recognise risk and respond to it. It's about making sure that where a child is exposed to abuse, that there are supports there and that they can access them, and then also about providing that access to justice, improving confidence in justice, and removing the barriers for children and young people within the justice system so that they can get justice and so that perpetrators can be brought to account as well. So I think education is absolutely part of that, but it is part of it, and all of those pieces need to come together to have the prevention, to have the protection, but also to have the support where it happens and justice where it happens as well.
That leads me to another question that occurred to me while you were speaking, which is, what happens in circumstances where you prioritise, the Department of Justice prioritises its actions, but some of the others say, we don't have the money, what can you do? What happens then? Because you might have prioritised, but if other people don't put their shoulder to the wheel, where does that leave the strategy?
I think all of the inputs that have been provided to the strategy, the strategy as a whole has been informed by departments collaborating, and it's been informed by us then also engaging with voluntary and community sector and people with lived experience, but departments collaborating, and all of the inputs that have been provided have been agreed with respective departmental ministers, with the exception, I have to say, of health, because of the change within ministers. The new Minister of Health hasn't had an opportunity to consider this, so it is very much still a draft strategy that will need to secure that agreement. So the measures that are in there are measures that departments have committed to and have agreed with their ministers, and I'm assuming on the basis of they will prioritise those.
You're hopeful at this stage. We'll take it we'll take that as read. Okay. You were going to speak to me then about the DAS pilot and the funding for the PSNI around Encompass, and I just have one further question. I have no doubt that the majority of people in these circumstances are absolutely genuine and having a horrendous time. However, I'm long enough in the tooth to know that there are cynical people who do the innocent and genuine victims a great disservice by claiming some of these issues in a bid to improve their contact arrangements and to improve financial settlements around divorce and so on. It is horrible that it happens, but we should be mindful that it does. So how will you monitor the extent to which some elements within this could be exploited and to the detriment of genuine victims and actually defendants who have been wrongly accused?
So on the criminal justice side, ultimately that's going to be a matter for the courts, and the behaviours are set out in the domestic abuse offence as to what constitutes domestic abuse. There are other offences that could be brought to bear with a domestic abuse aggravator, and that's a matter for the courts on the basis of the evidence presented to them. In terms of family courts, there are a range of number of pieces of work that are being progressed. So, for example, the Victims of Crime Commissioner has indicated that she wants to take forward a piece of research about family courts from the perspective of children. So very much touching on some of those. So I think there will be a lot of learning from that we'll want to consider whenever that piece of research is done. I don't lead on family courts, and so I don't want to stray too far down this because it's not the issues that I'm most familiar with. But I know that there is work that's ongoing around family courts, and the points that you've made. We're alive to them that those issues have been raised with us. In terms of criminal justice, the offence sets out the behaviours, and it will be for the court to determine, do those, based on evidence, has that offence been committed, and ultimately that's right, that it's for the courts. I don't know if you want to say anything about the pilot.
DAS pilot, yeah. So that's a Department of Health lead. I believe it's support for victims within trust areas and in hospitals, but we can get more information from our health colleagues on that pilot and send that through.
And on the rollout of Operation Encompass, it's in our action plan. The costs beside it are TBC. But I know from speaking with police, the TBC they're not insignificant costs, and that's one of those measures that will have to have additional funding for it to be rolled out. So that's an area where scale and pace of delivery is really impacted by available resources.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. Does anybody else have anything? We're okay. That's great. Ladies, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye. Agenda item 6 is a draft SR, the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, Search, Recovery of Crypto Assets and Investigations, Codes of Practice Order, Northern Ireland 2024. So I would refer you to pages 299 to 439 of your pack. Members, the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, POCA, or the 2002 Act, contains measures to enable the recovery of unlawfully held assets. The Act provides for codes of practice to be made in relation to the search, seizure and detention of property, powers to conduct investigations and the recovery of crypto assets and related items. The rule makes provision to revise 2 of the codes of practice and create 1 new code of practice. This is required following amendments made to the 2002 Act by the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act 2023 in relation to crypto assets. The rule will be subject to the draft affirmative procedure, and it is proposed that it will come into operation on the 17th of July 2024. The committee agreed that it was content with the proposal for the rule at its meeting on the 16th of May, and the department has confirmed that there have been no changes to the policy content since the proposal was considered by the committee. The Examiner of Statutory Rules hasn't yet reported on the rule. Do members have any comments? Are you content with the rule subject to the report of the Examiner of Statutory Rules, or is there anything else you want to know? Content? If you're content, then I'm going to put the question. That the Committee for Justice considered draft SR, the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, Search, Recovery of Crypto Assets and Investigations, Codes of Practice Order, Northern Ireland 2024, and, subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report, recommends that it be approved by the Assembly. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you, and I will outline the views of the committee in the debate on the statutory rule, which has not yet been scheduled. Agenda item 7 is SL1, the Court of Judicature Amendment Number 2 Rules 2024, and that's at pages 440 to 448 of your pack. This rule will amend the Court of Judicature Rules, COJ rules, to facilitate, alongside UK-wide regulations to be made by Parliament, implementation of the Hague 2019 Convention on the Recognition and Enforcement of Foreign Judgments in Civil and Commercial Matters. Hague 2019 it's called. It will also amend the COJ rules to make technical changes to the current procedure for recognition and enforcement of foreign judgments under the 2005 Hague Convention on the choice of court agreements cases to ensure consistency with the procedure to be followed for Hague 2019. This rule will be subject to the negative resolution procedure, and it is proposed that it will come into operation when the Hague 2019 Convention comes into force in respect of the United Kingdom. Are members content with the proposed rule, or do you have any further information or clarification you would wish to get? Content? Thank you. Agenda item 8 is SL1, the Police Service of Northern Ireland and Police Service of Northern Ireland Reserve Injury Benefit Amendment Regulations 2024, again at pages 449 to 472 of your meeting pack. The Department of Justice plans to make provision to place the Northern Ireland Policing Board guidance, The Department of Justice plans to make provision to place Northern Ireland Policing Board guidance to carry out injury on duty assessments provided to select medical practitioners and independent medical reviewers on a statutory footing, and to amend the Police Service of Northern Ireland and Police Service of Northern Ireland Reserve Injury Benefit Regulations 2021, further to a report by the Examiner of Statutory Rules, who brought to the special attention of the Assembly a number of drafting errors. These regulations make amendments to correct the errors identified. The rule is subject to the negative resolution procedure and is proposed it will come into operation on the 1st of July 2024. Are members content, or do you require any further information or clarification? Thank you. Agenda item 9, Police and Criminal Evidence, PACE, Codes of Practice, Consultation on Draft Revised Codes. So I would refer you to pages 473 to 1127 of your meeting pack for the relevant papers, and I have no doubt you have pored over these. The Department of Justice has provided a written paper on a proposed consultation on the draft revised Police and Criminal Evidence Northern Ireland Order 1989 PACE Codes of Practice. Are members content to note the written paper and note the commencement of a 12-week period of consultation on the revised PACE Codes A to H and the introduction of new Code I?
Read.
Yeah, noted. I'd be just keen to get the reserve, obviously, the outcome of the consultation. Obviously just concerned it's over the summer.
Yeah.
But just to get feedback in terms of just any equality implications and stuff as well. So just a wee update once it's completed. And just a brief summary, not 500 pages, just a brief summary in terms of people's opinions and views of what's contained.
Yep, a written briefing on the outcome of the public consultation will be provided to the committee, but I share your concerns around consultation this over the summer. The consultation document stipulates it'll commence in May, but today is the 30th of May, so it's not going to, which means a 3-month period, 2 months of those are July and August. So this is not a small piece of work. It is over 650 pages, I think. And there are a lot of changes. Now, by and large, I'm led to believe that these generally kind of just follow on from what's going on in England and Wales, and everybody tries to stay the same in that regard, but it's to afford people a reasonable amount of time, and over the summer period isn't ideal, I think, and maybe we should reflect that to the department, that we are concerned about summer consultations. Are members content with that?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll get a briefing then whenever the consultation is complete. Agenda item 10 is the mandatory court approval of minor settlements update on policy development. This is pages 1129 to 1133 of the meeting pack or the relevant papers. The department has provided an update on the policy development regarding mandating court approval of compensation settlements for children agreed before the issue of legal proceedings. Essentially, the correspondence indicates that the Minister is not going to pursue this. It outlines that the information that there was around this issue, there was no evidence, very little data, and essentially what there was anecdotal. So on that basis, I think the Minister's absolutely made the right decision not to proceed with this. Also, there would be concerns around where there would be a minor settlement of an insignificant sum. It could clog up the courts even further. So I think it was the right decision on that one. So we content to note?
Noted.
Thank you. Agenda item 11 is the forward work plan. So that's at pages 1135 to 1139 of your pack. Does anybody want to raise any issues on this? Quite a lot of oral evidence sessions at our next meeting, 3 oral evidence sessions, and an SL1. And I am conscious that there's a budget briefing in there and June monitoring.
June monitoring go at that stage, or is it going to be a potential delay, do you think, or?
That was the last I'd heard, was that we would take the June
It would still go
monitoring the
ahead?
same
Yeah.
day. Yeah.
Okay.
So, just if members would note that, but that's quite a lot in that day, and obviously this is our first opportunity to actually see what's going on, really, with the departmental budget specifically.
No, we've put the PPS off so many times already.
Yeah, it's got to go ahead.
Yep, agreed. Okay.
But I think that's certainly one where we don't want to be adding in anything more.
June, are we going in the first week in July as well? It's still penciled in, is it, or?
So there's nothing to stop the committee meeting that day. I think previously other committees, and I think perhaps one of the committees agreed maybe yesterday not to meet that week.
Because it's the election week.
It's up to the committee to make a decision as to whether it wishes to meet.
I suspect not.
No,
Yeah.
not.
Unless there was something urgent came up, because this came up in finance yesterday too, but it was more around the budget. I know economy have agreed not to meet that week, so
Communities as well have agreed not to meet.
if there's nothing like that's fair enough.
We've got at least one candidate in the room, so we could take apologies that day. Yeah, I'm not sure that even if the meeting were to go ahead, we would be quorate that day.
Yeah, no, it's
I suspect people's focus will be elsewhere. Is that a formal proposal?
Yes.
yeah, I think.
So who's making the formal proposal?
As long as members agree, Chair.
Yeah, I suspect that one's unanimous. Yes.
Yes.
Agreed.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's agreed. Thank you. Anything else on the forward work plan? No, we'll see then. We're 27th of June then at the meeting. Then our last meeting will be around the bill. Agenda item 12 is correspondence. So there's a correspondence memo and 17 items of correspondence at pages 1140 to 1254 of the pack. I'm going to draw your attention to a number of the items, and then I'll open the floor to take comment on any other items of correspondence in which you may have a particular interest. I would refer members to the itinerary for the visit to Magabry on the 6th of June, which is at pages 1156 to 1158 of the pack. And please, members, if you would pay heed to the guidance for the visit at page 1156 of the pack, which outlines the requirement for photographic ID and that mobile phones are not permitted in the main prison. There's other information there around parking and so on. If you have not already indicated to committee staff of your intention to attend or otherwise this visit and the visit to the court service on the 20th of June, could I please ask that you do that as a matter of import? Thank you. Also, for some of these visits, you're going to need to provide your car registration details. So committee staff sent out an email about that. I'd be grateful if you would respond if you haven't already and include that information. At item 12, there is a copy of correspondence from the Committee for the Executive Office to the PSNI, which is at pages 1253 and 1254 of the meeting pack. And this correspondence relates to prosecutions regarding the Hart inquiry into historical institutional abuse, and the Committee for Justice has been copied in for information. Can I seek your agreement to note this item and consider further pending a response from the PSNI? Thank you. Item 14 is a response from the Law Society of Northern Ireland at pages 1199 to 1205 of the meeting pack, and that's regarding the LCM on the arbitration bill. Do you remember we had kind of sought some information from them? So the arbitration bill wasn't passed prior to the dissolution of Parliament, which means that the associated LCM will not proceed. I would ask members to note this item and will write to the Law Society and thank it for its consideration of the issues and note that the bill has fallen. However, should it re-emerge, then their comments will be helpful. Members content? Thank you. At item 16, there is an invitation from the University of Ulster at page 1243 of the meeting pack to an event to discuss research on universal credit, digitalisation and the rule of law, which is to take place on Wednesday the 5th of June 2024. Anybody who wishes to attend that should register on the link provided on the invitation. Are members content to note that item?
Noted.
There's one other one I wanted to draw your attention to, which is the terms of reference around the policing board review. Where's that now? I can't find it. Yeah, there's it there. It's at page 1163 of the pack. It's interesting to note there what the terms of reference are. I presume that those will actually be agreed with the board, but as somebody who was on the board at that time, that issue arose around the Ormeau Road incident and in particular meetings between the chief executive of the board and the chairman of the board, around which the rest of the board was not informed or notified, and the board had sought the department would specifically look at that issue, but I note that this is considerably wider, so I presume that the terms of reference will be agreed with the board and they will discuss that themselves, but I thought it was important to make that point because I see no mention of that specific issue within the terms of reference, or within the issues. The terms of reference haven't been agreed, but I see no mention of that within the letter that has come from the department, you know, and that was the very basis on which the review was sought. Deirdre, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, it's just it'll be good to get the terms of reference obviously when they're ready, but yeah, just the same thing in terms of the independence of the policing board, just to ensure that they are that the terms of reference is agreed by both, so it would be good just to get that update when that's available, and then for us to get a copy of the terms of reference obviously as well once it's available.
Yes, I think the independence is key there, and it's not the time for an overreach. Right, does anybody else have any other issues on the correspondence? No, thank you. Agenda item 13 is... Oh, sorry, are you content to note all the other items?
Yeah.
Noted.
Yeah.
Thank you. Agenda item 13 is chairperson's business, and there is none. Agenda item 14 is any other business. Does anybody have any other business or any issue they wish to raise? No, all good, thank you. Agenda item 15 is date, time and place of next meeting. So we're due to visit Magabry prison next week, so there is no formal meeting. So our next formal meeting will take place on Thursday the 13th of June at 2 p.m. in this room. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Committee Room 30, sound.